Hey, shalom, 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 lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawabla atam, za'achikam yawam al Charlotte, which is good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya hamlakat hashamayim kwara, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call halayim la la abanaw Yahweh, bahasham Yahweh Shai, bahasham rachak wadash, wamashana la zaquim nawa, wamala akim shor rachak adulters. All praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, and the name Yahweh Shai delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is a lesson entitled Ayan Bahasapar, which is color in the Bible, or color in the book more specifically. All right, which the word for color is Ayan, all right, in which it shares the same word as Ayan, which is the eye, because, you're able to see different colors with the eye, so that's why it's synonymous with the word for eye. All right, and then Baha means and the Sapar goes into a book, all right, which it loosely translates, to the scriptures, being that the scriptures is pretty much, a book, So just wanted to get some edification on this topic, you see, because what has been done in times of antiquity, like the Renaissance, all right, iconoclasm, so on and so forth, Esau ultimately has deceived the masses of the people, all right, in which we're in a time to where the Lord ultimately is, bringing forth this truth amongst the planet Earth. So let's get this quick precept real fast. This is Isaiah Yeshaya chapter 28 and verse 17. And it says, verse 16, Isaiah 28 and 16 says, therefore thus saith the Lord power, behold, I lay in Zion for a foundation, a stone, a tried stone, a precious cornerstone, a sure foundation. He that believeth shall not make haste. All right, let's get this in the NLT. And it says, therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am placing a foundation stone in Jerusalem, a firm and tested stone. The stone, Yahweh Shai, Matthew, the 7th chapter. It says, it is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. All right. That's that, excuse me. Second Esdras 2 and verse 47, then began I to commend those that stood so stiffly, roughly paraphrasing, we're able to stand stiff in the Lord Yahweh Shai, you see, because the Lord Yahweh Shai is a sure foundation, whereas, these lies and stuff that ultimately was told, in Esau's history, they ultimately, it's not sure, all right? So continuing on, it says, it is a precious cornerstone that is safe to build on. Whoever believes need never be shaken, in which we won't be shaken ultimately, because, we're standing firmly, all right, we're standing through faith, all right, which faith, is synonymous with confidence. Con is with, fidence, going into fidelity, so something that's firm, something that's established, all right. So it says, verse 17, it says, judgment also will I lay to the lawn, and righteousness to the plummet, and the hail shall sweep away the refuge of lies, and the waters shall overflow the hiding place. All right, and the refuge of lies, the hiding place, ultimately plays into Esau's deception. All right, so what he's done, all right, ultimately, is he's, because in Hebrew, words have different meanings. All right, words have specific meanings. All right, and so what Esau ultimately has done is he's taken the words out of balance, and then also names out of balance. All right, and words and names, they have specific meanings for a specific reason. All right, and just going into the facet of color, all right, black goes into void of light, all right, dark, evil, all right, which that's true about the color black, you see, but he's placed it in deception upon, Jake. All right, and what that has done is it ultimately gives the conception or the thought, essentially, of something that's not good. All right, when it's on the contrary, when Jake ultimately, it is some wicked niggas, you see, but when in comparison to Esau ultimately, he invented niggas. All right, but when you compare the two, really, the root of the wickedness in the earth goes back to Esau Edom. Jake is just essentially subscribing to what's been given to him. So really, 2/3 of Jake got their part to play in it, you see, but Esau has his hand in the deception. All right, Psalms 144th chapter, that right hand of falsehood. All right. Job 9:24, the earth has been given into the hand of the wicked. He covereth the faces of the judges thereof. So, and the judges ultimately is the Israelites, starting with the Lord Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. All right. In which both the faces and then also what the judges stand for. All right. The scriptures. All right. What Esau has, even with the scriptures, Esau has taken the scriptures into himself. All right. But he'll use it as a face. But really what's on the inside, all right, is pure wickedness. All right. So, nevertheless, let's go back to this definition. It says color symbolism. It says color symbolism in art, literature, and anthropology is the use of color as a symbol in various cultures and in storytelling. There is great diversity in the use of colors and their associations between cultures and even within the same culture in different time periods. All right, and that's pretty much how Esau has used words and color to his advantage. Because during different time periods, it may mean something else. All right, in this time period, Jake is known specifically, all right, as black. All right, but in the ancient world, we wasn't going off of color. All right, color wasn't a thing until like the 1600s. So it says color symbolism in art, literature, literature, and anthropology is the use of color as a symbol in various cultures and storytelling. Skipping down, diversity in color symbolism occurs because color meanings and symbolism occur on an individual cultural universal basis. Color symbolism is also context dependent and influenced by changes over time. Symbolic representations of religious concepts or articles may include a specific color with which the concept or object is associated. So the concept, all right, the concept is that, Esau paints, all right, scriptures go into how, let's get a quick precept real fast. This is Psalms chapter 50 and verse let me see, verse 20, verse 19, verse 16. Excuse me. It says Psalms 50 and 16. It says, but unto the wicked, all right, which the wicked in the scriptures is talking about Esau, Edom. Salah. All right, yeah. The wicked in the scriptures is talking about Esau, Edom, the so-called white man. So it says, but unto the wicked the Most High saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth? Because Esau, Edom ultimately has taken the scriptures into himself. He said, when you go to, all right, court and stuff like that, that they'll make people swear on the Bible. All right, that, but then also in their like different political parties and different political gatherings, all right, judicial things, executive things, because Esau has like three branches of government: judicial, legislative, and executive, in which all of these, you swear by oath, all right, if you go to court, all right, which that's like judiciary proceedings, all right, but all of these essentially in one way, shape, or fashion subscribe to or the guise of the scriptures. All right, essentially Esau takes the scriptures to himself as a guise. All right, but that's not how this works. All right, because the scripture was given unto Jacob, you see, but ultimately Esau, Edom, has taken it upon himself to use the scriptures as the book, all right, of the lands that he essentially runs. All right, but that's not ultimately what's on the inside, you see, because that's why the scriptures go into, all right, the Lord saw it and it displeased him that there was no judgment. All right, because true judgment is not occurring in this place, you see, because Esau, Edom is not the rightful person to rule. All right, and the scriptures was never meant for him to take to himself. That's why it says right here, verse 16, it says, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth, seeing that thou hatest transgression and castest my words behind thee? When thou sawest a thief, then thou considerest with him, and hast been partaker with adulterers. Thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit, which Esau, Edom ultimately continually blasphemes, you see, but then also, he frames deceit, upon the 12 tribes. All right. But it says, thou sittest and speakest against thy brother, thou slanderest thine own mother's son. All right. So that's the point that I wanted to get, this word for slander. All right, because that plays into the concept. It says to give, to bestow, grant, permit, consecrate, dedicate. It says to commit, deliver, occasion. It says produce, requite, report, to mention. All right, to utter. All right, so going back, it says right here, symbolic representations of religious concepts or articles may include a specific color with which the concept or object is associated, in which it goes into the concept. The concept that Esau Edom ultimately tries to push, all right, is that Jake is the bad guy. All right, but really, Esau ultimately is framing Jake. All right, so it says with which the concept or object is associated, in which the object also would be the 12 tribes. All right, because Esau, in Esau's eyes, he treats it as if we're an object. All right, but he's used that to his advantage, and from antiquity up until this point. All right, it's just that now the Lord ultimately is in the Lord is in the process of exposure. All right, in which at a certain point in time, Esau could ultimately hide behind his deceit. You see, but we're no longer in that time period. So let's also get this. We'll get Acts chapter 13, because really when you say black, all right, that ultimately again goes into void of light. All right, but that has always been used as a derogatory statement. All right. This is Acts chapter 13 and verse 1. It says, now there were in the church that was at Antioch certain prophets and teachers, and Barnabas and Simon that was called Nigger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manon, which had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. All right, in which when you see countries like Niger, really that goes into black. All right, in which someone without understanding would say this says Niger, but it's going into again the term for black. All right, NLT, it says, among the prophets and teachers of the church at Antioch of Syria were Barnabas, Simon called the black man, Lucius from Cyrene, Manon, the childhood companion of King Herod Antipas, and Saul. So that has always been used as a derogatory term, being called black or nigger or so on and so forth, in which it doesn't just apply to so-called it doesn't just apply to Judah. All right, it doesn't just apply to Southern Kingdom. All right, because even going down, that's with the color you see, but then also with the Northern Kingdom. All right, giving Northern Kingdom different names like Hispanic, Latino. All right, those things are derogatory marks as well. So let's also get this. We'll get First Maccabees chapter 3, and we'll get verse 48. And it says, it's a lot. First Maccabees chapter 3, verse 48, and it says, and lay open the book of the law, wherein the heathen had sought to paint the likeness of their images. All right, in which we don't see a so-called Chinese JC. We don't see a so-called Ammon JC. We don't see a so-called Elam JC. The earth has been given into the hand of the wicked, in which you have the nations are ultimately wicked, but the most supreme wicked of all the nations is Esau, even the so-called white man. That's who we see painted as, that's who they want to give the image as if that is the Lord, you see. But we understand that's a counterfeit image, you see, because we get the description of the Lord, Hamashayach Yahweh Shai, all right, in Revelation, the first chapter, which this ultimately was a occasion to ultimately deceive. All right, that's how Esau ultimately thrives, is through deception. All right, so let's also get let's go to that. We'll get Revelation chapter 1, and we'll start at verse 13. And it says, verse 12, it says, now turn to see. Yeah. Revelation 1 and 12, it says, and I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned, I saw 7 golden candlesticks. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, and girt about the paps with a golden girdle. His head and his hairs were white like wool. All right, which that's denoting the texture. It says as white as snow. All right, which is going to the actual color. It says, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. All right, let's get a quick precept real fast. This is let me see, Psalms 147 and verse 16. It says, he giveth snow like wool, he scattereth the hoarfrost like ashes. All right, so that's why back in that, like in Django, he was like, hey, snowball, because back in antiquity, essentially, older Jake was called Snowball, you see, because that snow ultimately, that gives the color of the hair. All right, and that wool ultimately gives the texture. All right, that's why when we go into wool, all right, right here it says Tazamar, and it says from an unused root, probably meaning to be shaggy. All right, and when we go into this, it says so called from its being shorn off, and what you do with wool, you shorn it off of a sheep. All right, and that's like if you was to essentially trim a sheep, that hair look like Jake hair. All right, so going back to Revelation 1 and verse 13 or verse 14, it says his head and his hairs were white like wool, denoting the texture, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire. It says, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burn in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. So your feet going to be the same color as your face. All right, in which it says his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burn in the furnace. So so the Lord, if he was walking the earth today, he would be a melanated man. He would be considered so-called black. All right, in which he would be heavily melanated. It says, and his voice as the sound of many waters. So the Lord speaks with austerity. All right, he's the most austere man. All right, it's not the image, you see, because what Esau Edom ultimately has done is he's taken the image, he's taken the message. All right, because the message that JC comes with is, come as you are, go along to get along. Everybody's cool. Everybody, accepting. All right, nobody's going to be judged. Let's all love one another. But the Lord is an austere man. All right, the Lord is a just power. All right, so if you have been committing righteous acts, you'll get a righteous reward, you see. But if you're wicked, all right, if you're one of the wicked nations, it's no salvation, for you. You don't have anything to be saved from. All right, if you're 2/3, all right, and you have been working acts of wickedness, hey, well, you'll get rest in the kingdom, you see, but you're gonna have to be destroyed on this side. So it's a balance. All right, all love is out of balance. All right, all hate will be out of balance. All right, the Lord is a just power. All right, so I'm gonna get one more and that'll be it. But this is 2 Corinthians chapter 10, and we'll get verse 3, and it says, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh. Slakia. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through the Most High to the pulling down of strongholds. So Esau Edom, he's carnal. All right, when he tries to move with his deception, when that don't work, he got to come down, with the sword, because that's his blessing. It says, for the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through the Most High to the pulling down of strongholds, in which it's this word that ultimately pulls down those deceptions. All right. It says, casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalted itself against the knowledge of the Most High, and bringing it into captivity every thought to the obedience of Hamashayach. So it's this word that ultimately pulls down those gates, those bars, those fortified beliefs. All right, that we once had. All right, it's this word that ultimately the belief on this word that we was able to ultimately be obedient to the Lord Yahweh Shai. All right, but then also, just the imaginations, all right, and the different fortifications that Esau Edom ultimately tried to set up. Hey, well, that's being torn down too. And that's why the scriptures say it's something that you can do against the truth before the truth, because this word is going to ultimately expose the so-called defenses. All right, it's going to expose the so-called fortifications. All right. So it's going to the different concepts and rudiments and ideas that those that are so-called Christians and the mindset of this world, all right, ultimately penetrates that, all right, and so it leaves them to where they don't have no type of defense, all right, and that's through the spirit, so that's why the scriptures tell us to ultimately, walk in the spirit, because it's that's what we've been blessed, we've been blessed to have the inheritance of the spirit versus carnality, so I just want to go into that, you see, because the Lord is in the process of removing all deceptions, all right, and the truth is ultimately being declared amongst the planet Earth. So Adawan Tazaza Banaya Palos, that was a beautiful edification to the spirit. Wadawan Taza Atam Yashawam Tawab, Lord, as well. You have a good day. Washalam Lakam, which is peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.